Good morning and good afternoon to everybody out there. We're really ready to get started on this webinar. Appreciate everybody who's taken the time to be here. We have an exciting topic for you today, hosted by Convergence Networks and OmniData, Unpacking DeepSeek. Probably here because you've heard a lot of the news around that, and we are here to help address some of the questions and go over some of the things that people are talking about right now and give you a little more insight into kind of best practices around AI and its innovation and what is the security risk to this stuff as well. So with that, introductions, there's going to be four of us today. I'll start with me and we'll move from left to right. I'm Scott Zommers. I'm Senior Business Development Manager for Convergence Networks. And I've got about 30 years of experience in the technology space, and I can't seem to ever leave it because it's always changing. So, and thus, that's why we're here today. So, Steve?
Thanks, Scott. I'm Steve Mike. I'm a commercial lead for data and AI solutions at OmniData. I spent the last 5 years working with clients on AI deployments, both your traditional ML and AI. I'm really excited to touch on this topic today. John?
Good morning, everyone. My name's John Stevens. I am the Chief Information Security Officer for Convergence Networks. Been in technology for too long, not a number I'm going to admit right now. But anyway, I really interested in the applications of AI, and of course, in my role, most interested in the security impacts and so forth. So looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, John. Yeah, and I'm Henny. I look after the AI initiatives within OmniData. So good morning or good afternoon, everybody, wherever you might find yourself. I spent about 20 years in the predictive analytics space, various solutions from the traditional machine learning to the more generative AI solutions lately, and quite excited to talk to you about DeepSeek and maybe some of the best practices around generative AI in general as well. So Scott, I think it's then back to you.
Yep, perfect. Thank you, Annie. Before we get started, just a little bit of Q&A. The restrooms are in your building, so you should probably find them if you need to. Usually we do that for in-person. But if you have any questions, feel free to put questions in the Q&A, and we will get to those questions at the end, and we will make sure that we get as many questions addressed as we have. So with that, a word from our sponsor. Real quickly, Convergence Networks, a little bit about who we are. We are a managed security and services provider as well as managed services. So we help organizations across the US and Canada on support, security needs, anywhere from security consulting to infrastructure support, end-to-point detection. We've got a large enough organization where we provide service locally to our clients, but then we also have a national brain trust that we can pull from those high level things that people need. So when you look at what the areas we're pretty passionate about, this AI and security and best practices around that. And so our focus is making sure that we educate the community on what security best practices security are to keep the bad guys out, because we don't like those guys. So that's Convergence Networks in a nutshell. I think Steve, you want to talk a little bit about OmniData?
Absolutely. And, I'll briefly cover that OmniData is now Fresche Solutions. We were acquired in January, but our focus remains the same. We are Microsoft data and AI partners. We are also cloud solution partners. One of our biggest focuses is going to be on AI. And what we mean by AI is, co-developing generative AI co-pilots, things like AI agents, which has been all the rage lately, but also what you would consider to be your more traditional forms of AI, your predictive analysis, your machine learning models. Big part of that focus is the underlying data strategy and planning. We do a lot of data warehouse modernization and analytics modernization, also cloud optimization and modernization. So if you're really looking to clean up your dirty data, leverage modern cloud-based data solutions, and then build AI solutions on top of that, we are a great partner. We love also doing knowledge transfer, building with in-a-days and delivering a lot of free options to upskill at the organization. We can kind of move on now. Really excited to talk about the topic today, which is DeepSeek. You know, Elon had to throw a wrench in our plan by announcing Grok, I think yesterday, the day before. But a lot of the topics still remain extremely pertinent in this conversation. And that is, what is DeepSeek? Is this a foundational change? Is this just an evolution? Really diving in to the ins and outs of this particular model and this particular platform. And as we move on to the next slide, it looks like we might have lost Henny for a sec. True. Yeah, and I'll give Henny a moment to get back in. But one of the things I do want to lay foundationally is that when we're talking about DeepSeek, there's two things that we're going to be covering today. There's DeepSeek as a platform. And so when you go to their website, you start asking questions similar to a ChatGPT, there is this platform itself. And it's important to consider the security considerations, the thought process around what type of data you should be putting into that, what kind of questions, and really thinking about what the back end looks like. Because as many people know, this was built in China, and there are always going to be security considerations from using the platform. There is also the underlying foundational models. So what DeepSeek has done is open source their V3 and R1 models. And I think it's important to talk through that. And as Henny gets back in, I can kind of kick over to John to provide a little bit more color. You know, what is it? What is DeepSeek? I think how is it different, or is it different, is an important part to consider as kind of a two-parted question there.
Were you passing that to me, Steve, or waiting on Henny?
Yeah, why don't you kick it off, and then when Henny comes in, we can kind of provide a little bit more.
Sure. So you know, just as it says there on the slide, the basics. DeepSeek is an AI model, and as Steve mentioned, it is open source, developed in China, which he also mentioned. But you know, why is it in the news? What is different about it? Well, a lot of it has to do with the announcement with the recently of its development and its release, and the fact that according to DeepSeek, they were able to develop and train it at a much lower cost, like orders of magnitude lower, and that the hardware that it's required to run on is significantly less advanced. You don't need to have a tricked out high-end system to run it. You're supposed to get similar results running it on more mundane hardware. And so, you know, that in and of itself is responsible for a large portion of the uproar. But then there's also the fact, as Steve alluded to, it's a Chinese model. You know, most of what we have heard from AI has been generally big US tech companies. And when they talk about it, they're talking about how many millions, hundreds of millions, or billions of dollars that they're sinking into research and development. Well, DeepSeek comes along. They're not something that's in the US. They're a Chinese company. And to a lot of people, I think it just came out of the blue. And then they have the claim that everything is so much cheaper and will run on so little hardware, relatively speaking. So I think that's why we're talking here today, but it does raise a lot of important considerations. And it doesn't look like we have Henny back in yet, but you know, it raises the questions. How did a company that's not at the forefront, or at least is not known to be at the forefront, manage to do it better, faster, and cheaper? And you know, then the question becomes, well, is it how, or is it did they? Is it real? Because fundamentally, you know, there are some numbers that you have seen out in the news about what the development costs were. And like I said, they're so different. So, you know, in that regard, what are your thoughts, Steve? Do you think that it's something that we should trust those numbers, or is that kind of a grain of salt?
Yeah, and I don't want to touch on too much of the politics behind what that question entails, but I do think it's a fascinating story, because as you look around on the online, you'll have a lot of claims that, you know, the prices that they're quoting in terms of the hardware used aren't accurate. And, you know, part of the reasoning behind that is NVIDIA's got export bans on their more modern chipsets, their H100, their A100s. So the claim from DeepSeek is that they only used a few hundred H800, an older chipset from NVIDIA that is used to train these large language models. Not to editorialize too much, but I have a hard time believing some of the stories that come out about the cost, especially when you see maybe the intent was to really cause a scene in the marketplace. And, you know, it was, I think NVIDIA's stock crashed 17% the day that it was announced. It might have been one of the biggest shedding of market cap in the history of the market, if memory serves. You know, a lot of that is, hey, let's create an uproar by making a big splash, by making a big news story. And I think it's important to differentiate the two cost claims here, because there is one thing on the cost side that we have seen thus far, but it is kind of evolving and changing as we go around, which is the cost of the actual platform. You know, the token costs of how much it costs to run, you know, queries and build generative AI tools on it. There's also the cost claims of, oh, hey, we only spent $5.5 million training this. Then that leads to other questions of, okay, well, how did you train it? Because now you'll see stories that they actually just used, you know, maybe OpenAI's models to distill data and to train it on that. So I'm curious if you had any perspective and thoughts around that, John.
Well, so, you know, not being familiar with DeepSeek specifically prior to this announcement, you know, I don't want to frame it too much in terms of leeriness of them.
You just went on mute, John.
I had unmuted. Apparently the system didn't want to hear me talk. No, but what I was saying is that, you know, it always stretches plausibility when there's such a revolutionary leap forward, whether or not it's real. Now, whenever there's big claims like this, it doesn't matter whether it's AI or something else, technology is always advancing. And from a security perspective, you always have to take it with a grain of salt until it's maybe proven to work the way it's supposed to. And now that Henny's back, we can ask the expert on some of the differentiators from DeepSeek.
Thanks, John. Apologies, everyone. Zoom just had a little bit of a moment there.
Wouldn't be a webinar without some technical issues, would it?
Wouldn't be. Exactly. So yeah, I think in terms of DeepSeek, I'm assuming we're on that question around the what is DeepSeek and why is the model different. I mean, the difference in what DeepSeek have done here is they've taken a quite a unique approach to the reinforcement learning piece of the model building. And I think that helped them apparently to build this model on a lot less GPUs and a lot less infrastructure, so or less mature infrastructure. So yeah, they've found quite a unique way to build a large language model, a chatbot that's powered by this large language model, in order to answer these questions, and seemingly, you know, reasoning capabilities similar to that what you see from GPTs from the O1 model of families from OpenAI. So I think that sets them apart. It is quite a unique approach to the LLM. And in terms of that, the uproar and the why it's so important is, I think the big thing for me, at least when I look at it, is they went and they said, here's an open source model. So here's all the source code, here's the articles, here's how we did it. Now, compared to something like OpenAI's models, where those models are closed source, you cannot see under the hood how they do it and how they make these reasoning decisions. So I think it's going to allow a lot of competitors to OpenAI, Meta, Google, etc., to also leverage this thinking and see how they can apply it into their models, and potentially, you know, leapfrog and getting to that level, the top level, sooner than what they would have done had they continued the way they did.
And kind of building up this, I'm curious from of your perspective on this. Do you think of something like a DeepSeek as evolutionary or revolutionary? Because I think day one, the news story dropped like a bomb on the AI market in the United States, and it seemed like it was this massive revolution. As we've had time to kind of sit on it and start to utilize it in application, it seems to me like more of a natural evolution, where of course the early model development is going to be the most costly. The you know, the early adopters, the early development is always the most expensive. So I'm curious on your perspective on evolution versus revolution.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think evolutionary probably in the sense that, I mean, it is similar in performance, at least on the benchmarking that we've seen so far, to the other models, the Claude models, GPT models, etc. It's performing well, sometimes slightly outperforming something like O1, and in other cases very similar. So in that regard, it's an evolution. It's a new model, but if the way they trained this model is as cheap as they have done. I mean, I had a look at, I think it was Meta's models I had a look at. They were having 100,000 GPUs in their cluster to train their llama models, compared to what these guys use, apparently about 2,000. So that is quite revolutionary if you think about it in terms of the consumption, compute consumption that's needed. I know there is also a lot of question marks in terms of the way they got there and how they got that data, and that's something we need to take with a grain of salt. If you do go and read the articles, or the article that is the basis for this model, I mean, I know there's a lot to be said about the $6 million or just below $6 million that it costs, but they do state in that article that that is only for the training of the model. Having built a few models in this sort of space in the past, I know that the model building is often, from a time and a consumption point of view, the smallest part. Is the most complex maybe, but it's the smallest part in terms of consumption. The data preparation, data gathering, data cleansing, etc., those sort of things can take a lot of time and can take a lot of compute. So they don't make any mention of what they had to do to get to that stage to train the model. So it's a little bit difficult to compare apples with apples. But like I said, from the use of the reinforcement learning methodologies that they've done, there's definitely a quite unique approach. They didn't go with a complex neural network reinforcement learning approach, but more with a rule-based approach. I mean, you can think about that. Anything that's rule-based is going to be a little bit less compute intensive than something as complex as a neural network. And I think that's where they found the benefits. But again, it's open source, right? So anyone can now take it and go and replicate the results, possibly. And if there are more and more competitors that are replicating these results, then we know it's legit in terms of what they've done.
I think that's a good note to move on and really talk about the practicality from a technical perspective of, thinking about this from a development perspective. I don't want to narrate too much, but, I would suggest to be very cautious if you're going on DeepSeek's platform and putting any type of sensitive data there. That's just a clear line in the sand. In the same way that I would suggest to be cautious if you're going to ChatGPT and putting sensitive data there. But there are definitely more concerns about where that data is landing. I really want to think about this more from the open source model perspective. As we move to the next slide, really what we're focused on at OmniData is technical applications. When you're developing a Gen AI copilot, when you're trying to build AI agents, how to select which model to use. Something like Azure AI Foundry, which is what Microsoft uses to help build active enterprise development of AI tools. They have a number of different models available. DeepSeek, I was shocked with how quickly was onboarded into Azure AI Foundry. I think it was about a week old, and they said it was secure when deployed through Azure, and they provided that as an option to do development. So I think my first question, Henny, would be, is DeepSeek's model easier to develop compared to other models, and thinking through some of the considerations around actually using it to develop Gen AI copilots for internal use?
I think to your point, I mean, if you're using something like Azure AI Foundry and you have access to all these models that you can simply deploy and almost rip and replace, if you will, so you can deploy some of these base models, deploy a GPT, deploy a Llama, deploy a DeepSeek model, and you can really use them interchangeably in your application. It makes it a lot easier, something like Azure AI Foundry, to use that. DeepSeek is no different, right? So it's part of that Azure AI Foundry model catalog, and you can leverage it within your applications fairly simply and as easy as all the rest. I think obviously we're going to get to that in a moment as well, but the cost implications, what is the cost, how much does it cost per token, those would be the considerations. I think, again, for me, in terms of is it easier, for me it's taking a pragmatic approach and saying, what is actually the use case? What are we trying to do here? I mean, we just busy finishing up with a client where the main KPI for the LLM or for the AI agent is latency. It's response times, and can we get that as low as possible? So having a clear understanding of what we're trying to achieve, is it quality of output? Is it low latency, fast response times, like I mentioned? And then plugging in and playing with different models within something like Azure to see what works for you. Instead of just saying, let's just throw DeepSeek at the problem because it's going to solve everything. It might not, but you need to have a clear understanding of your current environment, current use case, and what you actually want to do with it.
And I think we're talking about pricing. I did want to just kind of throw a clarification out there of, could you give us a little bit of understanding of just like how typically these models are priced in something like an Azure AI Foundry, specifically tokenization?
Yeah, so it's token based. So tokens, think of tokens as, I mean, we're writing text in these. If you think about ChatGPT, DeepSeek, all of these models, you're giving it text most of the cases, and it responds in text. That text is chunked up into small pieces, normally about 3 or 4 characters, and that becomes a token. So all of these small chunks of whatever you give to the model to give a response, that's chunked up, and that consumes tokens, and that's how it gets priced. Most of them are pay as you go. So as you use these tokens, you get charged for the number of tokens that you use. Some models are equipped to be able to run larger what we talk about a context window, so you can give it a massive amount of information and it can respond. Some models are a little bit shorter in that context window, so it can only take up to a certain amount of tokens. But that's generally how it works. Normally a pay as you go. There are some other models where you can kind of have a dedicated pool of resources for these LLMs, but generally it's about pay as you go per token.
And so when you're working with a client thinking through, hey, what's the right model here? Is there any pros, cons that you can think of when, being an early adopter of a new model? Yes, it might be cheaper per token, but are there any other considerations around those costs and the implications of using certain models, selecting a 4.0 versus a V3 from DeepSeek?
Yeah, I think absolutely the evolution and the revolution, I guess, from the start of LLMs, we all knew about hallucinations in the beginning, and that's really, I don't want to say taken care of, but it's gotten a lot better. There's a lot less of that to take care of. And I've seen that now as well, where you get the smaller, older models that's maybe a little bit faster in responding, but there's a little bit more chance of hallucinations because the newer models takes care of it. I think in DeepSeek specifics case, we were talking to a client where they had a specific requirement for the LLM needs to understand Arabic, the language is in the Middle East. And there we had to choose carefully one that can actually respond and speak in that language. I think if you look at DeepSeek, from what I've seen, is it performs well and comparable to O1 in coding and math and language understanding and so on. But it seems to also definitely outperform in Mandarin, which kind of makes sense, right? Given who built it. So my guess would be is if you do have a large customer base in the Chinese market, you've got a customer call center type agent that you want to build using these large language models, it might be a good fit because it probably will answer Mandarin questions a lot better. So you need to think about those pros and cons. Obviously, some of the models, the cons would be if you go for a more advanced model, you might pay a little bit more, but you need to think about the impact of hallucinations and what the use case is that you're trying to solve.
And I know I asked this question previously, but I was more thinking about this from a broad perspective of the development of AI models. I am interested, have you seen any transformative changes with DeepSeek in terms of developing in something like Azure AI Foundry? Or again, is this just kind of like another natural step in the growth?
So far, I think, given it's fairly new, so far just another step, another model that we can leverage for a particular use case. Nothing out of the ordinary, if that's the question. It's yep. Like we said, it's comparable in terms of the benchmarks as well to something like O1 that we have. Possibly, I think where the main transformative piece is going to come in is going to be once we get the costing on an Azure environment. I know there's costing available for the public endpoint, but that might be a big decider once we get to that.
Yeah. And we're going to touch on pricing a little bit later, but I did want to mention one of the things I've noticed is, the per million token cost of DeepSeek has already tripled in some cases, and we still don't even know what the cost of is in Azure AI Foundry. So that to me is something to think about when you're choosing which model you want to develop internal AI tools with, is really being able to have long-term planning. What are the right decisions to make? That's some of the risk, I think, of early adoption of any of these, is you just really don't know where it's going to go. There could be a day where they're like, oh, sorry, we have way too many users. And now all of a sudden the cost per token, per million tokens is 10x. So that's something that I always like to consider when being that early adopter. There's benefits. There's also risks involved. John, I did want to talk to you a little bit when we're talking about OA or AI use, especially internal AI use for organizations, is shadow IT and how we can avoid it and how it's pertinent in this discussion around AI.
Well, so obviously, just to define the term, shadow IT is generally any technology, application, software that's used and it's not necessarily authorized or maintained by IT. So the problem with all of the proliferation of cloud applications and everything else is that all you need is a web browser, and then you can suddenly be accessing a whole new application. And in fact, if it's done in the shadows so that it's not a endorsed effort, well, who's monitoring to see what the data that's being uploaded to that is? And so, fundamentally, this is something that existed far before we had to worry about DeepSeek or any of these AI models. Ultimately, there's a lot of different ways to avoid it, but it really comes down to how much control and visibility does IT really have, and how much are they paying attention? When you talk about a typical SMB environment, it's not like there's going to be a great deal of budget to be spending money on detective capabilities, such that if somebody plugs something in or somebody goes to a new app site, that you can detect that. So it really makes a strong case that the first thing you have to do is make sure your folks actually understand that shadow IT can cause problems, not just for loss of data, but the fact that you're putting data into unknown buckets. It's not following approved flows. How secure is that bucket? It's an entire process to validate a vendor and make sure that you think that they are safe enough to work with. And if you've got people who have no idea of how to do that, effectively doing it on behalf of an organization, that's trouble on the wall, right? The writing's on the wall that there'll be trouble down the line. And so this is just another consideration when you start talking about these AI models, especially when it's so easy to use them. You can go online and you can get prompts for OpenAI or ChatGPT or what have you. But yeah, so that's the challenge we face. We want to invest and take advantage of all the innovation, but we also want to do it in a conscientious and deliberate manner.
Yeah, and I think we've all seen the news stories out there, the risks of all of a sudden somebody throwing a PDF of sensitive company information into a publicly available LLM. That's definitely not best practices. And that's why it's important to really think about the kind of enterprise decisions around what AI tools are available to employees and how they're used, and why we work very closely to develop more secure generative AI applications that are only deployed on company infrastructure. I do think this gives a good natural handoff. Scott, I'd love to pass on to you to talk a little bit more about the security perspective around these generative AI models, DeepSeek, and also kind of just a general discussion of the tools available to us.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Steve. So, security is top of mind on a lot of things. DeepSeek, this new era that we're entering into, certainly isn't new necessarily in the sense of the concern around security. Anytime there's a new development, a new model, a new solution out there, poses against a bigger threat to IT, and just another potential avenue for the bad actors to be able to get into the network and do some of the things that we don't want them to do, and we're trying to keep them out. But one of the good things is, and what we're going to talk about in this next section is, what are some of the things you can do to mitigate the risk? And really, we're going to approach this from a best practices perspective. So the question I have for you guys is, what are the potential risks for using DeepSeek's model? Like, is there any issue with especially using it for internal development? And what do you do about the sensitive information that you're putting into it?
Sure. So when I think about the security in terms of the recent development with DeepSeek, I feel like there's risks, and some of them are specific to DeepSeek. Some of them are specific to the fact that DeepSeek is a Chinese company, and then there's just some general best practices. Now, I'll touch very briefly on each of those. So, as one of our attendees asked, has DeepSeek had any response on the security claims from the public? To my knowledge, there hasn't been a lot of response. But to that point, some of the security claims that we're talking about includes things like a database that was a DeepSeek database found online and didn't have any of the data redacted, and people could go in and see what it was all about. To include what were people sending as queries, what were the responses, etc. Another kind of technical concern is in regard to the dangers of AI in general. So when we talk about AI, everybody likes to talk about hallucinations or it's so fast and convenient. But in fact, is it going to produce not just accurate results, but safe results? Can AI be used as a tool for malicious purposes? And obviously the answer to that question is yes. It's a tool, which, it's the effect of a tool is always going to vary depending on how it's used. But one of the things that I've heard quite a bit about in regard to DeepSeek is that it has fewer guardrails than some of the more mature, well-known models. In other words, you can get it to produce malicious content more easily and in more detail than along a lot of the other models. So when we're talking about DeepSeek as a security risk, well, there's the fact that, well, their operational security may not have been great. They've had a breach already with their database online, so that's a problem. And then you have a relatively new solution, and I say that meaning AI in general, that has a lot of great power, but we want to make sure that there's guardrails so that we don't basically shoot ourselves in the foot. And those are the two most explicit concerns I've heard about with security regarding the technology of DeepSeek. Now, of course, there's also security concerns because it is a Chinese company. And so their data, their servers, typically, if you're talking about running it on their platform, is in China. And Chinese law gives the Chinese government access to that data if they request it. So, we're fundamentally talking about data that almost certainly, unless you're doing it yourself, you're using their model in an internal environment, it's going overseas. And so it's really important that we're cautious about the data that we're putting there, not just because we don't know where it's being, it's more than just the general fact with any AI model that it's going into somebody else's system, but the fact that we're sending it overseas. And it brings up the question, which as we move into some of the more general concerns, what's your policy? What can people put into an AI model? Is it going to actually cause some kind of breach or disclosure? Have you read the terms of service? These are all things that have to be considered when we're talking about using new technology. And, at the risk of sounding like the person who's just dancing around sowing fear, uncertainty, and doubt, I'd like to pivot to maybe some of the ways you can safeguard yourself. Because, if you are worried about putting proprietary information into an AI model, whether it's DeepSeek or anything, well, maybe it's as relatively simple as making sure people realize that's not allowed. They have to understand that corporate data belongs to the company and that there needs to be some policies about how that works. Similarly, when we talk about earlier, we were talking about shadow IT. Folks have to understand the term and understand that it's not appropriate and or could be a security risk. Actually, there's no and or, it's just and could be a security risk. And this is more Henny's bag than mine, but there's still the fact that AI is relatively new, so that you're talking about hallucinations and or maybe inaccuracies. It's not necessarily meant to be malicious, but how do you know what the output is going to produce and what were the possible biases? A great example, yesterday, as I was kind of playing around, I went to ChatGPT. And of course, you can get to their website, you can try it now, and you can enter your input, your prompt, and it's free. I did the same thing. I went to go to DeepSeek, and they wanted my phone number or email and me to create an account. I was like, yeah, I don't think I want to do that. But the one thing that really I found interesting on ChatGPT and this speaks to, well, are there biases in it, or is there any kind of, because you don't know what it was trained on. I typed in a little prompt about, hey, write me an introduction to a scary story where the hero's at a keep in the mountains, blah, 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 blah. And the scene is that just come around a corner and see this big keep. Well, what I found interesting was the first time I wrote that prompt, it gave me a very well-written response, but it also said that the hero of the story that was watching all this, for some reason, was a he. And I'm not saying that to single out ChatGPT, but just to say, well, I was very careful in my prompt not to say male, female, or anything else. But that to me seemed to indicate that there could be some level of bias there. And I think that's something that we have to consider as a potential security concern in any use of AI, not just DeepSeek. And of course, I couldn't do the same thing in DeepSeek because I didn't want to give up my phone number or email. But anyway, so all of that notwithstanding, there's a lot of concerns. One of the things that Henny and Steve both touched on was using the model in your environment. And so when there's all of these unknowns, a lot of it's related to where is the data? Well, you can address a lot of those by simply choosing the environment, right? You can say, I'm going to use their model, but I'm going to put it in my Azure instance. And by the way, I've got all the security controls turned up so I can actually verify whether there's any data going to places that it's not supposed to. And so to that point, the second from the bottom bullet, deploy it in a safe environment with additional security measures so that we don't have to worry about all of the problems that we've already talked about. And so really it's about doing it with a very deliberate and intentional and well-conceived plan. And that just doesn't happen if folks, do it shadow IT. They're just throwing stuff out there. So a whole lot of security concerns, but I think there's some very easy ways to make it easier and less risky.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think, John, I support and fully agree with everything you said. The security issues are definitely there. And like you said, on the second to last bullet point, I would not go to the public-facing API at this point. And for that matter, I don't even use OpenAI's public-facing API in the same sense. I rather do these things in Azure because I know that Microsoft guarantees that none of that, the prompt and completion pairs are being sent anywhere. It's inside that subscription. They deploy the model within your subscription and everything stays there. But I think also to note, Microsoft does deploy things like content filtering and abuse monitoring, etc. models as well. So when you deploy this thing in Azure, those things are deployed as well, which means both the users and the models' responses and prompts are being scanned for abuse and for content filtering. And if something were to be flagged, they would send that to Microsoft saying, listen, have a look. It doesn't send the prompt and the completions and the responses, but it does say, have a look, there's something going on. Now, I think that adds a little bit of a layer of security, at least on that front. There are some content filtering that's going to happen. Your security risk concerns, I fully share. And I think the other thing, just to add to that, is it is new. I would treat this similar to treating a new package or new library to do some sort of forecasting that comes out. You need to have a look at those, the folks that produced the library. Are they going to be supporting this thing going forward? Is this library still going to be updated and be well maintained going forward? Because you also don't want that to happen where you tie yourself in with your code into a DeepSeek, let's say, model. And I don't know, 6 months down the line, it gets shut down and that model is just not being maintained and you cannot do anything anymore with it. And then you have to take it out and put something new in. So you're tying yourself, you're creating technical debt in that scenario. That's going to cause concern. So fully support the views, and definitely if it was me, look at something like an Azure subscription where you can ring fence it and have some control, not just from a content filtering and abuse monitoring, etc., but also have the keys to the vault where you can give access to only those folks that needs access to use these models.
Perfect. Well, this is a great topic around security. Security also is tied with what kind of, how do you enable the business to with still providing the security, letting business move forward. And so is it economical? Does it make sense to utilize this? And how do you put it into an environment to where you're not stopping the flow of creativity, you're not stopping the flow of all of the advantages that AI can bring. And then so looking at some of the business considerations are also important as well. So next slide. Moving on. Is DeepSeek a viable tool for internal Gen AI development via Azure AI Foundry?
Yeah, I'll take this one. I think it's again comes back to your use case, and it comes back to the KPI that you're chasing with your Gen AI use case, right? So if I'm building a generative AI solution that needs to extract information and be able to do that with a high level of quality versus something that's going to give me a faster response time, I mean, I would set up my environment in such a way that I can interchange these models and see which ones works the best. I would definitely do it, like I mentioned previously, in an Azure AI Foundry environment rather than the public-facing API, just to make sure that we have the security measures in place. But yeah, it's going to depend on your use case. Does DeepSeek, when you start looking at the accuracy, the quality, the latency, and so on of your use case, does it actually give you what you need? And obviously then the cost comes into play as well.
Perfect. Which always brings us to kind of the costs. Like, is there any cost savings to using DeepSeek's model versus the other ones, or how does that work?
Yeah, I think from what I'm seeing at the moment, I mean, it is cheaper. They're selling it as cheaper per million tokens or per 1,000 tokens in terms of the amount. Again, I had a chat to Steve earlier as well on this. You need to have a look at, does it answer the question that I want to get answered? Or maybe it's twice as cheap, but it takes 3 times prompting to get the same answer, or to get the answer that I'm looking for, which is not going to be cost saving in that regard. It might be cheaper per million tokens, but it's going to cause you to ask the same question 3 times. So definitely, depending on your use case, it could be cost saving, it could be really cheap. I think if I look at the cost, at least on the public endpoints, given that it's apparently so much cheaper to have built, it's not that factor cheaper in terms of if you compare it to, like, I think I looked at the 0301 mini models, and I think if I remember correctly. So it's very comparative in terms of that cost. But again, if you need to ask the same question 3 times, then does it work? For me, also, like I mentioned earlier, if you have something that needs to maybe interact in a certain use case, that needs to be able to speak Chinese very well or Mandarin very well, maybe that works a lot better in that scenario.
And I just wanted to kind of add, one of the things as I was really diving in, and it's so new, so it's hard to find real world applications where you truly benchmark the output. You can say, yes, the cost per million tokens is significantly cheaper than OpenAI's considerations. But one of the other things I've heard is that it requires significantly more tokens for the reasoning. So when you have these complex thoughts, when you're doing things like coding, or maybe you're trying to dive very deep into really complex topics, you've got millions of PDFs, some advanced learning capabilities, it still requires 3 times as many tokens to get to that reasoning. So you're required to have kind of more tokens used to get to the same answer. So that's where you start to balance out the cost efficiency. I also think when you're thinking about pricing is, who knows where this lands? They've already raised the prices between double and triple for the per million tokens, and we don't quite know the Azure AI Foundry costs to deploy quite yet. So it's also thinking long term of, would you rather have more confidence in pricing, or would you rather take more of a gamble on something that's cheaper now but could end up being more costly in the long run? Also, just kind of as an aside, my hope is that regardless if you want to use DeepSeek, one of the things I'm happy to see is this is just further evolution that is forcing OpenAI to possibly reconsider their pricing model. And so you should have kind of an overall pressure on decreasing overall costs related to developing Gen AI over time. And each evolution should continue that pricing narrative. sorry to jump in with my own aside. It's just something.
No, it's great. That's perfect. We've covered most of the stuff on here, but I do with the third one, wanted to, and I'm going to add a little something to this. So we talked a little bit about the risks, and it's probably for John. We talked about the risks associated with DeepSeek and some of the AI models, but how do you balance that with work efficiency? Because when you look at it from a business consideration, the amount of savings of time and things that AI can bring to the workforce, how do you balance that and the security and the risk associated with that?
Would it be obtuse of me to say carefully? But realistic. I think it all comes down to what we were talking about earlier. You have to be very deliberate and informed, and you have to weigh the potential return on any investment or the cost savings because things are more efficient with the potential risks. You know, again, it might be more effective in 9 times out of 10, but what if that 10th time causes you to spend more activity to get the right answer, right? What if it actually causes a problem? So I think it's always about an organization having a good idea of their risk tolerance. Because anytime you're talking about innovation, there tends to be a certain risk that goes along with that. You're trying new things, you're trying new products, you're trying new processes, and you may realize savings in time or money, or you may not. So there's that risk proposition. And so I think what's really critical is that organizations really think about the risks and make sure that they're in touch with their own risk tolerance. Sometimes you make a big gamble and you're willing to gamble a lot for a big payout, but sometimes it blows up in your face. So, it's one of those things where you have to make sure that the organization is going into this with all the knowledge they need and an informed risk assessment or decision. And again, I'm not talking about maybe writing it down to the dollar level type of risk assessment, but you have to understand the ways that things could go well or go south.
Okay, perfect. So I think at this point we've gone through the questions here. So we have a couple of questions in the queue. And maybe we can answer those live since we're here. And that is, can you elaborate on how you would use models like DeepSeek without exposing your organization to the risks? Is that event even possible?
I'll give my few words on that. I think, like I mentioned, making sure that you use it within a confined environment like an Azure subscription instead of integrating with DeepSeek, the public-facing API. So if you go onto DeepSeek, if you Google and you go DeepSeek API, you can obviously start sending prompts and get completions and responses from that. I would not integrate that way with DeepSeek. If you wanted to, I would go into an Azure AI subscription, make sure it's self-contained, make sure you've got all the security measures in place there, who gets access to that environment. Like I mentioned, there you have content filtering and abuse monitoring and things like that as a standard already deployed, and do it that way if you wanted to go this way. Go with DeepSeek.
And I do kind of want to throw out this to provide some contextualization and pass this to you guys as well. Is it's really important to differentiate that when you're deploying this open source model, you are, or maybe I'm wrong about this, you're alleviating the concerns of this data living in a Chinese server because this is deployed and self-contained within your own Azure environment. Yes, no, or is there something to think about in terms, because I have heard some gaps on like the back end side, even when deployed through Azure AI. I'm just kind of curious to get your perspective on that.
So I think what Henny said is all about keeping as much control over the evaluation or the usage as possible. And I think there's a couple key points. One, you are trying to alleviate the potential of your data going to China. That's the easy part. The other part is trying to limit the risk related to vulnerabilities in the model, whether it be accessing it with nefarious prompts or what have you, but by putting it in a highly controlled environment where you strictly control access of who can even get it, you're making sure that it's not there to be abused. And then if you have an environment like Azure with a lot of detective controls, it can also give you that peace of mind to ensure that there's no data beacons going out beyond. So in that example, I think you kind of have the best of both worlds. You're defeating the notion of it going to China because it's on their servers, but then you're also taking control of your own destiny and really monitoring that environment and controlling access to it so that you can proceed with that development with a little bit of confidence in what you're doing.
And even beyond Azure AI Foundry, you can run the open source model locally or on like an Azure VM, correct?
That's my understanding, but I would argue that regardless of what flavor you run, you still want to approach it with that same kind of very controlled, very monitored environment, because whether Microsoft provides the detective controls and the monitoring, or whether you do it because you've put it in a separate subnet on in your business network or what have you, if you don't have that additional visibility and that additional peace of mind, I think that that's just it. Frankly, it's risky, dangerous, and not well advised, in my opinion.
Okay, and that I think that answers the question on the server room. Do you think it's cheaper over time if you put it on your own server?
I would defer that question more to Henny because he's more of an expert on the execution of the models.
Yeah, I think over time, Scott, I mean, if it is going to get cheaper over time on your local server, potentially, I mean, I guess so over the longer run, but I fully support what John was saying in the sense that you need to approach it with the same caution if it's in the cloud, if it's on your local PC or on a local server, it doesn't matter. I again would, it's a difficult one. Do you look at the cost just from the token usage, or do you look at the cost from token usage plus all these risky elements that we said now that Azure kind of might take care of it in a sense of content monitoring, abuse monitoring, etc. Because those could be unintended consequences that could have a massive cost also to your business. So it's a holistic approach that you need to take. Again, these are new technologies. We need to be careful with what we do with them and how we approach them. And I would use as much as possible to do risk mitigation as I can. It shouldn't be just a cost conversation at the end of the day, because there might be some costs that you don't think about that could come down the line as well.
Yeah, like the human cost is an important consideration. When you're leveraging something like Azure for this, you've already been able to benefit from the effort Microsoft's put in to create security parameters around the model itself. Whereas when you deploy it internally, then you have to manage that risk yourself. You have to keep a much closer eye, and you have to do a lot of the kind of tasks necessary to set up those parameters rather than just leveraging Azure's. And that's kind of that classic on-prem versus cloud debate of what's more secure. We don't need to touch on that, but I do think it's an interesting thing to consider when you're talking about AI development.
Definitely, and to Steve's point, I think ultimately, if you're playing with AI, you're not there to play with, become a security professional before you can deploy the AI, right? And so I think being able to, quote, select the environment in Azure or something like that and just have a few levers and controls that you need to enable versus having to make sure your firewall's configured, your IDS, make sure your SIM. It's just, I can't, from a security perspective, unless you've already got all of that already built out. If we're talking about, the average mom and pop business or SMB, I think it probably isn't going to be all that much cheaper to do it yourself because of all the other things that you have to do and all the expertise that you should bring to bear to make it safe.
Makes sense. We have one more question in the queue. That is, what measures are in place to ensure DeepSeek doesn't collect or store any unintended data from my system?
John, I'll let
I
you go
honestly,
first.
well, I honestly think it comes down to the points we've been making throughout, that you have to take responsibility for that. And one of the things that a piece of research I did bring, that I did look up as I was looking at DeepSeek, is when they're talking about their terms of service, they say they collect extensive data, including keystroke patterns and rhythms on your input and device info. So, right in the terms of service, it says it's going to collect data, but not that that's any different from any of the other models. But the way you limit that is, like we said, put it in an environment where you can control and verify whether anything's going out. And now I'll be quiet and let Henny go.
No, fully agree. I think I read the question. The question, what measures are put in place to ensure DeepSeek doesn't collect? You're spot on, John. I think the answer is you shouldn't wait for DeepSeek or rely on DeepSeek not to collect, because they obviously want to collect the prompt and completions, because they want to retrain and use that for other purposes. We've spoken at the beginning. I mean, the Chinese government in this case has different AI governance rules and how they use this information. So it's not about what DeepSeek is going to do. It's about what you're going to do and how you're going to approach this. And like John was saying, like we said throughout the webinar, make sure you take control of the keys. If you have the keys and you don't give those keys away to your environment, then you've got a lot more control over what happens. Don't go into the public endpoint, because then you don't have any control anymore. All your prompts and completions are going to be used for at least retraining purposes, if not something else.
I still think, to be fair, from like a political perspective, the same considerations are there when you're using Grok and the public-facing tool, or ChatGPT's public-facing tool. They are using your inputs to continue to retrain their models. So that's why our recommendation is always, when you're thinking about sensitive data that's going into an enterprise AI application, to self-contain that into your own environment, and do not use the public-facing tools for anything that be concerning in terms of sensitive information. You've seen folks get fired from their position because they maybe put a service manual up into ChatGPT. It's very, very important to be cautious of any public-facing AI tool for sensitive information.
Okay, great. Well, unless there's no more questions in the queue, is there any final parting thoughts that anybody, Henny, John, Steve, have for the audience before we depart?
I think just final thought from my side is, it's not about DeepSeek or Grok or OpenAI, like we've mentioned a few times now. For me, at least, it's more about, do you understand your use case? Is your environment set up so that you can actually test? Because if you don't have that set up from the start, then kind of having discussions about DeepSeek on its own is irrelevant. Make sure you understand what those KPIs are that you're driving, and make sure you can test those and you can experiment with them, and then see, should we use DeepSeek? Should we use Grok? Should we use something else? And then use it, obviously, like we've mentioned a few times, use it in a contained environment where you have control. I think that's the critical part.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I just going to give Henny the thumbs up and call it good.
Perfect. Anything else, Steve?
No, I was really appreciative. John, Henny, Scott, thank you for your time today. I thought that was a really good discussion. I've seen a lot on the security implications of DeepSeek. I haven't seen much discussion around the implications of leveraging this for internal development. And I do, my own aside, I see a lot of potential, but I see this potential with every iteration of a new AI model coming out, where we're just constantly evolving, reducing hallucinations. But we always need to take ownership of the security aspects and being very deliberative in how we deploy AI solutions internally.
Well, great. I want to thank everybody for their time. Thank you, Henny. Thank you, John. Thanks, Steve. And thank you, audience, for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed it. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.